So, Qiuyuan has finally arrived, meaning that we actually have the opportunity to have a Chinese character and have an excuse to go into Eastern symbolism again. It's also one of the rare male characters that we can analyze, as they have a level of sophistication depth that warrants a long video like this. So I've been looking forward to it really ever since we've done the last one, being Brant, when I first started making these resonator symbolism videos. I've been looking forward to analyzing Qiuyuan and Buling, especially after having to read the Bible for hours on end for Galbrenna and the whole of the 2.7 update really. So without any further ado, let's get started. As always, be wary of spoilers from this point onwards.
完成夜色故人
As usual with a lot of Chinese-inspired resonators, it's pretty important to understand what Qiuyuan's name actually means. Qiuyuan is a sort of transliteration of two Chinese words, one of which is reflective of the ch rather than the q sound. Though I suppose that kind of depends on where in China you're from, what accent you have, but at least from where I'm from, it's more of a ch sound than a k sound. So anyhow, Qiuyuan's name is composed of two words, the first being chou, which is a word that sort of translates into being kind of like a hatred or anger. You can see this for example since the word chou is also used in other words such as baocou, which means revenge or vengeance in Chinese. The second word of Qiuyuan's name, Yuan, is really simple because it's just a word for far in Chinese. So essentially the direct translation of his name would basically mean faraway hatred. But of course there's a couple ways we can interpret this. First off, we can understand the faraway hatred as Qiuyuan's past, where he was filled with hatred and enmity within his childhood and also when he worked as an internal security bureau as an agent. You can see this for instance within his character stories, the badge and uniform he still wears, as well as his battle with Geshe Lin, which is explored by Fenrico as a sort of inner darkness that he's moved away from, and he's kind of far away from in a sense. Additionally, the yun, or the far component, can sort of have a connotation as meaning kind of like the fact that Qiuyuan is a wanderer that carries on a kind of hatred or grudge that he has yet to repay, being the revenge of both his grandmaster as well as also the fact he failed to kill Geshe Lin. We can see this when Fenrico asks Qiuyuan if he regrets not ending Geshe Lin. And because of that, he is someone who travels to faraway lands to help Rover and Renacita, essentially fueled by the shadows of his past. This is actually a really common trend in Wuxia novels as well, where characters are kind of like, more oftentimes than not actually, fueled by some sort of turbulent events or past or vendetta, right? Where essentially, at the end of the day, no matter how you want to interpret, Qiuyuan's name and character is basically the same as this, that he's kind of sort of like a wandering swordsman with a troubled past. As one of the most prominent plants of Chinese culture and a crucial part of Qiuyuan's story and design, bamboo is part of his forte, his skill names, his weapon, his life, and nearly everything about him. When we look at the symbolism of bamboo within Chinese culture and stories, much of it roots from a Song Dynasty poet and essayist called Su Shi, who was almost infamous for his love for bamboo, writing several poems and even essays on bamboo, and even essays on other artists' paintings on bamboo. Like many of the poets such as Li Bai, which are related to Qiuyuan, that we'll talk about in a lot more detail later, Su Shi often was in trouble with the law and was constantly on the run. He was actually exiled, right? Basically being the same as Qiuyuan, who was banished from the ISA and lives as an outlaw. I think he's a fugitive in 6 cities, according to a story. So anyhow, Su Shi is one of the most famous Chinese poets to write about bamboo, even famously saying in one of his lines and poems, I can live without meat in food, but can't without bamboo in view. Without meat, body will lose weight. Without bamboo, life will lose taste. This reflects bamboo as one of the 4 noble plants in Chinese Confucian ideology, a place it shares the plum blossom, the orchid, the chrysanthemum, and you better believe that, considering that it's the only of one of these 4 plants that isn't a flower, that isn't pretty, bamboo has got to be pretty damn important. The 4 noble plants in Chinese culture are said to be noble because they each represent core Chinese virtues, with bamboo, especially within Sushi's poetry and wider Chinese culture, being symbolic of many of these. For one, bamboo is often iconized with resilience. If you've seen bamboo, or perhaps had the displeasure of growing it, you would know that bamboo not only grows absurdly fast, but it also spreads really quickly. I think that one thing that people who haven't really interacted physically with or seen bamboo don't understand about it is that most bamboo species are basically weeds. Like, you can't kill bamboo, the shit spreads so quickly, and it's basically immortal because unlike other plants, bamboo spreads and it roots horizontally, not vertically. The bottom line of all of this is that bamboo is basically unkillable. It's super resilient and it always weathers terrible situations. And you can see that when a character like Qiuyuan is associated with it, it iconizes perseverance and resilience, which you can see through his character stories where he's had to weather disaster and disaster after disaster. So yeah, the other symbolic nugget when it comes to understanding the symbolic value of bamboo is that it echoes the Confucian values of truthfulness and humility. As I mentioned before, bamboo is the only one of China's 4 noble plants that isn't a flower. It's not pretty, it's unassuming, right? It's common, it's cheap, but it's also versatile in a way that it has a kind of verdant charm of its own. Bamboo, unlike other woody plants as well, is also hollow, right? Bamboo doesn't have anything inside of it, and this, within Chinese culture, is symbolic of a sort of spiritual truth. It's kind of like people with nothing to hide. The hollowness of bamboo stems are kind of a reference to truthfulness, of not being two-faced, of not being filled with vices like vanity. I think this whole symbolism of bamboo is just perfectly summarized with Qiuyuan's signature weapon description, which reads as follows: bamboo, hollow, yet full. People, whole, yet seldom true. Bamboo speaks without deceit, acts without conceit, seeks no vanity. Few ever measure up to thus.
寒风笑逆，竹林间，夜交错呼。
Within the official livestream where Kuro discussed the combat systems in the game, it was officially recognized that Qiuyuan, to the surprise of basically nobody, took on a lot of inspiration for the Chinese wuxia genre of stories. While this and its tropes are basically common knowledge to many people from Eastern countries, the references to it are not as apparent, I would suppose, to Western audience, so I'll dedicate a small chapter here to just talking about it. To put it simply, wuxia is a popular genre. It's usually set in ancient China, where wandering martial artist heroes, capable of these superhuman abilities, exist in a sort of lawless kind of bandit land sort of setting, and I'll go through kind of like what that is a bit later on, so hold on for a minute, right? So within this setting, there's heroes, and despite oftentimes running into troubles with officials and the state law, they're oftentimes depicted as moral, as honorable, and chivalric, right? And that's something you can obviously parallel to Qiuyuan, who was banished by the internal security agency. He's a wandering fugitive, and he has a bounty on his head, but he wanders the lands as a sort of evil-killing, roving martial artist swordsman. So To truly understand, essentially, how wuxia links to Qiuyuan, we need to understand at least two tropes which Kuro has directly even mentioned within their livestream are basically quintessential to the wuxia genre, being the Jianghu and Qinggong. The Jianghu is a primary setting of most wuxia stories, and is essentially a kind of lawless area where what rules are not state laws, but martial prowess and honor. That's why so many wuxia stories include run-ins with outlaws and bandits in the wilderness like bamboo forests, because they're set in lawless places where the main martial arts heroes can be closer to spirituality and nature in the absence of law and society. The second trope is Qinggong, a sort of martial arts practice which roughly translates to light body skill. If you've ever seen a single wuxia show in passing, I'm sure you would have seen the martial arts heroes basically flying, or running along roofs, or jumping across trees and all that. That's Qinggong. We see this not only in Qiuyuan's skills in combat, but also excellently within Qiuyuan and Geshulin's fight in the bamboo forest, where they balance on thin surfaces and even on bamboo itself. While Qinggong is an actual legitimate training method for martial arts, which is meant to improve agility and jumping power, it's something that is famously exaggerated to the extreme in wuxia to show martial artists moving, jumping, and balancing on various surfaces to a sort of superhuman, nearly ridiculous level, which is more often than not combined with swordsmanship because they're wandering swordsmen, right? Qiuyuan's skills, which have him jumping across bamboo stalks for example, as well as his fight scene with Geshulin, basically bleeds the wuxia genre. And it's nice, because even though I'm personally not the biggest fan of wuxia stories, it is very good they did take references from this chunk of Chinese storytelling. One of the things that has been symbolically integrated into the design of many of the Eastern-inspired resonators of Wuthering Waves is the four beasts. This isn't the four beasts of the Book of Revelations in the Western canon, but the four beasts of the East, which each represent a constellation and cardinal direction. I've actually talked about this already within my Jinsi and Changli video, so it may not come as a surprise that both of these resonators actually fit within this hierarchy. The four beasts in Chinese mythology are each represented by a resonator in Wuthering Waves, with the black tortoise of the north being represented by Tao Qi, though I think this may change in the future, and the eastern azure dragon being very obviously filled by the Qianlong or Jian, the southern vermilion bird being, again, very obvious reference to Changli, the central position of the yellow dragon being Jinsi, who represents the central power Huanglong, and the western white tiger being originally Ling Yang, who was a general in the Wuthering Waves beta if you didn't know, but now I believe to be replaced by Qiuyuan, who has both the white and black cloth and fur in his design, as well as also kind of this sort of character traits that make this connection. So, to begin, we need to of course talk about the Baihu, or the white tiger of the west in English. The Xifang Baihu, which occupies the cardinal direction of the west and the autumn season, is a figure in Chinese mythology that embodies strength, justice, and righteousness. It's because of this that the white tiger was, I suppose in Western terms you could say the white tiger is kind of like a patron saint for soldiers, martial artists, and warriors in China because of what it represents. This, of course, is a perfect link to Qiuyuan, who is not only a strong martial artist and warrior, per his kind of wuxia-esque background that we discussed previously, but also because he embodies this kind of justice and righteousness as a sort of executioner for the Mingting High Court, which is something we'll be going into with the next chapter on the Imperial Lion and the Bian. When we look at the cultural canon of the white tiger as well, we see that it's being associated very heavily with metal with blades, with precision. Qiuyuan's ultimate line literally reads, "One strike to settle it all," which is a parallel to the kind of traits and the personality and the ideals of the white tiger of the West perfectly. We can see that essentially beyond just the design, also the personality of Qiuyuan essentially embodies the white tiger, of a kind of figure that is precise, careful, calculating, but also just and righteous. Although lions obviously aren't native to China, tigers and lions are one of the more common symbolic icons within Chinese mythology and culture. Even if you aren't well acquainted, I'm sure you've seen Chinese guardian lions or their iconography somewhere or in passing. It's like, for example, in the gates of Chinatown or something, at least, right? And this is really important for Qiuyuan because not only is the badge of the guardian lions or tigers, depending on how you see it, on Qiuyuan's clothes, but it also becomes a rather central symbol of authority, justice, and mastery within his character showcase and story. So anyhow, one thing I need to say is that through Qiuyuan's character stories, we learn that his metal badge is actually noted as a Chongqi beast in a story, but I think its description and role is not really that of the Chongqi, but something different. For instance, we can look at Chinese guardian lions, right? Which for some reason are called fu dogs in the West or something, I don't really know. But they're basically just stone lions, or shishi in Chinese. They're the kind of statue symbols you see at the entrances of homes, palaces, and temples, because they're believed to have protective properties and are communicative with status and power. However, if we are to narrow this down even further, we can see that the closer link to Qiuyuan is a similar symbol, but one that is slightly different, being Bian, the seventh of 9 sons of the dragon. Being commonly depicted as a tiger, Bian is emblematic of, just like the white tiger in the previous chapter, being authoritative, just, fair, and righteous. In fact, Qiuyuan's badge that he wears, which we know from his second cherished item, is actually a token of the Mingting Internal Security Agency, which is a perfect match for Bian, because in Chinese culture, Bian and the white tiger are emblematic of justice and righteousness. Decorations of these two, for example, were often used on places that meted out justice, such as famously being very commonly used as door knockers on prison gates, which is why you can actually see the iron ring on Qiuyuan's badge, because it's meant to be a door knocker, right? Ancient Chinese judges also carried badges similar to that of Qiuyuan's, that essentially not only embody his values of justice, but also his kind of pseudo-official role as an executioner of the Mingting, of someone who delivers justice, essentially. Even though Qiuyuan, of course, no longer works for the security agency, the fact that he still keeps this badge is a nice sort of match to other aspects of the symbolism, such as the setting inspiration of the lawless roving wanderer in the Chinese Jianghu. If you had to make me name a single person who was the biggest inspiration behind Qiuyuan's character, the strongest contender would have to be the drunk swordsman poet who wrote some of the most popular and loved poems in the Chinese language, Li Bai. Not only does Qiuyuan and his drip marketing paraphrase and take inspiration from the poetry of Li Bai and other Tang Dynasty poets, which we'll draw upon soon, Li Bai as a person was also very obviously chosen as an inspiration for Qiuyuan. He is a swordsman poet, he loves alcohol, and he even wrote poetry in a kind of lawless style that kind of embodies the Wuxia trope of the Jianghu, which we previously already discussed. However, before we talk about Li Bai, we need to talk about the wider context of poetry during the Tang Dynasty that Li Bai was actually writing in. oftentimes considered the golden age of Chinese poetry. A compilation of Tang poetry contains nearly 50,000 poems, written by over 2,000 individual poets. Like many other eras and cultures where poetry flourished, much of this was because poetry was important and valued in nearly all aspects and levels of society. It was so important, in fact, that poetry was actually even tested on the infamous Imperial Civil Service exam. Naturally, of course, the poetry that was tested here would be on a very high level, and oftentimes followed strict parameters and structures, such as within the Lushi poetry style, which usually required a very specific 3 lines and 1 rhyme. The reason why we talk about this is because Li Bai and many of the Tang poets that are related to Qiuyuan as a character actually tend to subvert these rigid poetic norms. They spend their time in remote, natural places, and they focus on freedom and writing without restraint. Li Bai, especially, was known as a wandering poet who loved traveling, alcohol, and swordsmanship. He was oftentimes seen as uncouth and a drunkard, and his poetry, which echoes freedom and often breaks away from the state-mandated styles of Lushi poetry, is a perfect match to Qiuyuan. The trope of the drunk swordsman poet, which Qiuyuan's character is heavily inspired by, effectively comes from Li Bai as a person. Qiuyuan's drinking, his tendency to speak in a Wuxia poetic style, as well as even his weaponry, which comes from notes that Li Bai was an excellent swordsman, especially when he was drunk, is very obviously a parallel with one of China's most famous and eccentric poets. Li Bai's rejection of dogma and the state-mandated poetic form in favor of freely expressing his thoughts as well is another inspiration for Qiuyuan, who lives an existence beyond the law, which relates to the wuxia trope of the Jianghu that Kuro, as we talked about before, was inspired by. I'll let this following quote speak for us. Li Bai's eccentricities were, in many ways, a reflection of his artistic genius and his rejection of societal norms that hindered creativity and individuality. His refusal to conform to traditional expectations did not necessarily equate to a lack of courtesy. Rather, it was a conscious choice to prioritize his artistic pursuits and personal freedoms over the constraints of societal conventions. However, the inspiration of Li Bai and other Tang poets for Qiuyuan goes just beyond characterization. Within Qiuyuan's drip marketing, I was able to find 3 Tang poems that I'm pretty confident are directly linked and inspired. Within the 2.7 livestream, when Qiuyuan was first revealed, the announcer introducing him was quoted with saying, "Through winding groves of bamboo, as green vines brush my sleeves," which is nearly a direct quote, with some allowances of course for translation, with Li Bai's poem Down Zhongnan Mountain, where 2 lines in the poem read, "And led me twining through jade bamboo, as the green vines catch my clothes as we walk." This connection is emphasized even more when we see a post from the Twitter drip marketing, where Qiuyuan is sailing down a river in a boat amidst a bamboo forest. The caption to it reads, "A lone boat carries me afar, 100 miles and my heart alone." This is a nearly exact thematic hit, an inspiration from a poem that we've actually covered already on the channel within the Jinsi video, being Li Bai's Seeing Meng Haoran to Guangling from Yellow Crane Tower. Within the poem, Li Bai stands on the Yellow Crane Tower, a pagoda, bidding farewell to a friend whose silhouette grows smaller and smaller as they sail away down the long stretch of the Yangtze River. The poem's main themes are basically the exact same as the caption, but from the perspective of the friend on the boat. Being a Chinese farewell poem, it discusses separation and wandering within the background of the immensity of nature and the seemingly endless and eternal Yangtze River, hence in Qiuyuan's post saying 100 miles and my heart alone. It's a short poem, so you can see the inspiration of the caption and ideas easily within the last 2 lines, which read, "The lonely sail is a distant shadow, on the edge of the blue emptiness, all I see is the Yangtze River flow, the far horizon. The final poetic reference is rather interesting, in the way that not only is it not from Li Bai, but also is rather unique, in that it's kind of inspired in a video form, with Qiuyuan's convene animation being inspired by a Tang Dynasty poem, written by Wang Wei, another Tang Dynasty poem in the Lushi style, that was isolated and close with nature. The poem Bamboo Grove Pavilion, which I'll read out now, is very obviously the inspiration of Qiuyuan's convene animation. Alone I sit in the remote bamboo grove. I pluck the lute, then long I sing. Deep in the forest, no one knows I exist, but the bright moon comes shining. Within the three-line Lushi, you can see all the elements of Qiuyuan's convene animation: playing the musical instrument alone in the bamboo grove, isolation in the forest, and the appearance of the bright moon as an expression of heaven, of isolation, or emotion, depending on how you want to look at it within the framework of Chinese culture. Regardless, the inspiration of Tang poetry, especially from Li Bai, is definitely there, and it's really cool to see Kuro delving into Eastern literature after I've been buried in the Bible for ages. The Bible, Dante, and classicism, oh my god. Several patches already. I'm kind of a little bit sick of it. The last aspect we have to talk about in regards to Qiuyuan is his blindness, which took me a while to think on and figure out. For one, the idea of a blind swordsman is not exactly original. It's not very uncommon in wuxia novels to begin with. You have characters like Feng Qingyang, who rely on a sort of spiritual mind sight, similar to how Qiuyuan is blind, but also senses and sees the world in bamboo. And when you read his forte examination reports, you actually see that, essentially, it's directly quoted. His forte is quoted as mind sight, which got me thinking, because this is rather similar to a lot of Taoist principles of connecting with the concept of the Tao, which roughly translates to a kind of natural order or the way of the world, depending on how you want to see it. The whole concept of the Tao is designed to be undefinable, so it's kind of up to interpretation. But anyway, within kind of like this Taoist spirituality, there's this kind of prioritization of a spiritual mind sight rather than any sort of physical vision. Because of this, Taoism is really big on going above the normal human senses and kind of cultivating spiritually, because that is essentially the way in which you can truly understand the workings and the truth of the world. Within, for example, the two most important texts of Taoism, the Zhuangzi and the Tao Te Ching, sages, or people who live in line with the Tao, are capable of seeing truth and reality beyond physical form, seeing instead with a kind of inner vision, or with the mind. You can take, for example, this famous quote from Zhuangzi: "The sage sees with the mind, not the eyes." So considering that Taoism is honestly something that has a much bigger influence on Chinese literature and culture than many people think, this whole idea of Qiuyuan being blind, but instead having a sort of spiritual sight that allows him to see the truth of the world, to, in his own words, see things that others cannot, actually makes a lot of sense in regards to Taoism. The whole concept of how he taps into his mind sight, with his law entries and many of his skills and moves, making direct reference to this whole idea, and kind of this whole idea about how it requires him to drink a sort of medicinal alcohol in order to tap into the world of bamboo that he uses in combat, essentially kind of parallels this idea of going beyond the physical boundaries of human sense, right? And this is made even more interesting because when you get to see Qiuyuan's very last character story, you actually get to kind of see the fact that his niece is Sanhua, who is Jinse's bodyguard. And as you know already, Sanhua, like Qiuyuan, was born with blindness in both eyes, and they both, coincidentally of course, use swords. Unlike Qiuyuan, who sees the spiritual world in bamboo, Sanhua sees the spiritual world within frequencies, which allows her to also see the truth of the world and people, who kind of mostly appear as twisted ghosts. Despite the differences, both of them being related, both of them being born blind, and both of them having a sort of Taoist inspiration, especially considering both the concept of the inner spiritual vision, is a very interesting match. And during this analysis as well, I did also realize that Sanhua literally wears mala beads on her character, which are important within both Taoism and Buddhism. So all in all, this spiritual perception of the world, combined with this sort of drunk swordsman trope we already discussed with Li Bai, makes a very interesting blending of a lot of Eastern inspirations, which is just absolutely fascinating. And with that, we are finished with Qiuyuan. Honestly, this video was quite chill and enjoyable to make, quite refreshing even, I would say, since I've been stuck doing Western symbolism for ages. So with that in mind, I do reckon I might keep on going actually and make a video on Buling, because I'm already seeing some interesting stuff I can talk about, and I have talked about already with the I Ching divination. But of course, that'll have to be coming in the next patch. So thank you very much for watching this far into the video, and as always, I hope you guys are all having a good day. I'll see you guys next time.
Your blade is ready. Do what your heart commands.
I won't stop until I find the one who did it. Thank you, Master.
Beneath endless mountains, all who have met must part. Walk a path boldly. Descend the mountain.